The storm hit the Montana territory with a fury that hadn't been seen in decades, turning the afternoon sky black as midnight and sending everyone with sense scrambling for shelter. Violet Brennan cursed herself for not listening to her instincts that morning when she'd woken to an uneasy stillness in the air. But the cabin needed firewood, and winter was coming fast in these mountains outside Taylorsville. Now she was caught halfway up the hillside with an armload of branches that would barely last 2 days, let alone the brutal months ahead. And the wind was whipping so hard she could barely keep her footing on the rocky path. She'd been living alone in the cabin for 3 months now, ever since her father had died from a fever that took him in less than a week. At 22, she found herself suddenly without family in a harsh land that didn't forgive mistakes or weakness. The cabin was paid for, at least, a small mercy her father had managed before his death, but everything else fell on her shoulders now. She'd never gathered enough wood for a full winter before. Her father had always handled that, spending weeks in the fall building up a supply that would see them through until spring. The rain started as fat, cold drops that soaked through her wool shawl within seconds. Violet stumbled, dropping half her armload, and bent to retrieve the scattered branches with numb fingers. She couldn't see more than a few feet ahead now, and the path back to the cabin had disappeared into a gray curtain of rain and mist. Lightning cracked overhead, so close she felt it in her chest, and the thunder that followed shook the ground beneath her feet. She was trying to decide whether to abandon the wood and just run when a figure emerged from the storm like something out of a fever dream. Tall, impossibly tall, with shoulders broad enough to block the wind. For a terrified moment, she thought it might be a bear standing upright, but then lightning flashed again, and she saw it was a man, massive and solid, with dark hair falling past his shoulders and a thick beard covering half his face. He wore buckskin and fur, and an axe hung from his belt that looked like it could fell a tree in 3 strokes. "You need to get inside," he called out, his voice deep and rough but somehow cutting through the wind. "This storm's going to get worse before it gets better." Violet clutched her inadequate bundle of wood tighter, instinctively stepping back even though every part of her knew she was in danger from the weather, not this stranger. "I'm heading home now." "Where's home?" He moved closer, and she could see his eyes were a striking pale blue, almost gray in the storm light. His face was weathered and hard, the face of a man who'd spent years in these mountains, but there was nothing threatening in his expression. If anything, he looked concerned. "The Brennan cabin down the valley." Recognition flickered across his face. "I knew your father, good man. I'm sorry for your loss." He glanced at the pitiful amount of wood in her arms. "That's not going to last you more than a few days." "I know that," she snapped, embarrassed and frightened and cold straight through to her bones. "I was gathering more when the storm hit." He looked up at the sky, then back at her, making some kind of calculation. "Come on, I'll see you home, then I'll deal with your wood problem." "I don't need help from strangers. Vincent Emerson. Now I'm not a stranger." He said it matter-of-factly, already starting down the path in the direction of her cabin. "And you do need help, whether you want to admit it or not. Pride's a luxury in these mountains, Miss Brennan. It'll keep you warm right up until it gets you killed." She wanted to argue, but another crack of lightning made the decision for her. She hurried after him, struggling to keep up with his long strides. He seemed to navigate the storm-darkened path with ease, never stumbling, moving with a confidence that spoke of countless hours spent in these hills. After a moment, he slowed his pace to match hers, and she was grateful even though she didn't say so. The cabin appeared through the rain like a miracle, its rough log walls and stone chimney exactly as her father had built them 15 years ago. Vincent waited while she fumbled with the door latch, her fingers too cold to work properly. Without a word, he reached past her and lifted the latch with ease, pushing the door open against the wind. The interior was dark and cold. She hadn't left a fire burning, worried about sparks with no one home to watch them. Vincent moved past her into the cabin with the easy confidence of a man used to taking charge of situations. "Get those wet things off before you catch your death. I'll get a fire started." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to." He was already kneeling by the fireplace, arranging kindling with practiced efficiency. "I'm doing it anyway." Violet peeled off her soaked shawl with shaking hands, hanging it on a peg near the door. Her dress was wet through as well, but she wasn't about to strip down with a strange man in her cabin, no matter how cold she was. Instead, she grabbed a blanket from the trunk by her bed and wrapped it around her shoulders, watching as Vincent coaxed a flame to life from the kindling. The fire caught quickly under his skilled hands, and soon warmth began to spread through the small space. He added larger pieces of wood from her nearly depleted supply, building the fire up until it crackled cheerfully, pushing back the darkness and the damp. Only then did he stand, brushing his hands on his buckskin trousers. "You've got maybe 3 more days' worth of wood here," he said, surveying the small stack by the fireplace. "And that's if the weather stays mild, which it won't." "I know." She pulled the blanket tighter. "I've been trying to gather more, but it's slow work alone." He was quiet for a moment, studying her with those pale eyes. She had the unsettling feeling he was seeing far more than she wanted to reveal, reading all the fear and uncertainty she tried so hard to hide. "I've got a camp about 2 miles north of here. Been up in these mountains for going on 8 years now, trapping and hunting. I know where the best deadfall is, and I've got the tools to process it quick. I can't pay you. Didn't ask you to." He moved toward the door, and she realized with a start that he was planning to leave to go back out into the storm. "I'll come back when the weather clears. Get you sorted for winter." "Why would you do that?" He paused with his hand on the latch, looking back at her. Water dripped from his hair and beard, pooling on the floorboards. "Your father helped me once, years back. I got caught in a blizzard and he let me shelter here for 3 days. Wouldn't take payment then either. Figure I owe him, and since he's not here, that debt passes to you." Before she could respond, he was gone, disappearing into the storm as suddenly as he'd appeared. Violet stood staring at the closed door, her mind churning with questions. Vincent Emerson. She tried to remember if her father had ever mentioned him, but nothing came to mind. Then again, her father had helped a lot of people over the years. He'd been that kind of man, generous to a fault, always ready to lend a hand or share what little they had. She moved closer to the fire, letting its warmth seep into her chilled body. The storm raged outside, wind howling around the cabin's corners and rain hammering on the roof, but she was safe and dry now. Safe because of a stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere and asked for nothing in return. The next 3 days crawled by with agonizing slowness. The storm blew itself out by morning, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of pine and wet earth, but Vincent Emerson didn't return. Violet rationed her firewood carefully, keeping the fire small and banking it at night to conserve fuel. She ventured out to gather what branches she could find near the cabin, but everything was soaked through and would need time to dry before it would burn properly. She began to think he wasn't coming back, that his offer had been nothing more than words spoken in the moment and forgotten as soon as he'd returned to his own concerns. She told herself it didn't matter, that she'd been managing on her own for months now and would continue to do so. She'd figure out the wood situation somehow. She always figured things out. On the 4th morning, she woke to the sound of an axe biting into wood. Violet scrambled out of bed, still in her nightgown, and rushed to the window. In the clearing beside her cabin, Vincent Emerson was hard at work on a massive fallen pine he must have dragged down from the hillside. He'd stripped off his fur jacket despite the cold morning air, and his shirt was already damp with sweat. The muscles in his back and shoulders rippled with each swing of the axe, and the tree trunk split cleanly under his blade. He worked with a steady, powerful rhythm that spoke of enormous strength and years of practice. She dressed quickly, pinning up her honey-colored hair and splashing cold water on her face from the basin. By the time she got outside, he'd already sectioned off several large pieces from the trunk and was starting on another. "You came back," she said, the words coming out more surprised than she'd intended. He paused, resting the axe on his shoulder, and fixed her with that steady gaze. "Said I would. Most people don't keep their word like that. I'm not most people." He said it simply, as a statement of fact rather than a boast. "You got coffee." "I do." "Then coffee would be welcome if you're offering." Violet hurried back inside and set about making coffee, her hands moving through the familiar motions while her mind raced. Through the window, she watched him return to his work, the axe rising and falling in that same steady rhythm. He wasn't just cutting the wood into lengths, he was splitting it properly, making pieces that would fit in her fireplace and dry efficiently. This wasn't a token gesture or a few hours' work. This was serious effort. She brought out 2 cups of coffee when it was ready, the steam rising in the cold air. He accepted one with a nod of thanks and drained half of it in a long swallow, apparently unbothered by the heat that made her sip carefully. "This is a big tree," she said, looking at the massive trunk. "It must have taken you hours just to get it down here." "Most of yesterday and some of this morning." He finished the coffee and handed her back the cup. "It'll give you a good start, but you'll need more. I'll bring down another 2 or 3 this size over the next week or so. That should see you through till spring, even if it's a hard winter." "That's too much. I can't ask you to do all that." "You didn't ask. I offered." He picked up the axe again. "Now you can stand there arguing with me, or you can let me get back to work. Your choice." She chose to let him work, but she didn't go back inside. Instead, she busied herself stacking the pieces he'd already split, carrying them to the lean-to attached to the cabin side where her father had always stored the winter wood. The pieces were heavy, and her arms ached after the first dozen trips, but she kept at it. If he was going to put in this kind of effort, the least she could do was help where she could. They worked in silence for most of the morning, falling into an unspoken rhythm. He would split the wood and she would stack it, the pile in the lean-to growing steadily higher. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill, and Violet found herself stealing glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking. There was something almost hypnotic about watching him work, the pure physical power he wielded with such practiced ease. She'd never seen anyone handle an axe like that, each swing perfectly controlled and devastatingly effective. Around noon, she called a halt and insisted he come inside for a proper meal. He tried to wave her off, saying he had jerky in his pack, but she was firm. "You're doing a full day's work and then some. The least I can do is feed you properly." The cabin seemed smaller with him in it. He took up space in a way that wasn't just about his size, though he was easily the biggest man she'd ever been this close to. There was a presence about him, a sense of coiled strength and competence that filled the room. He sat at her small table, looking slightly uncomfortable on the simple wooden chair, and accepted the plate of salt pork and beans she prepared. "How long have you been up in these mountains?" she asked, sitting across from him with her own plate. 8 years, like I said, came out here after the war." She didn't ask which side he'd fought on. The war had been over for more than a decade now, and most people were trying to forget those years, not dredge them up. "You ever get lonely?" He considered the question, chewing slowly. Sometimes. But I got used to my own company during the war. Guess I prefer it now. Mountains don't ask questions or expect things from you. They just are, and you learn to live with them or you don't. Sounds like a hard life. It is. He met her eyes across the table. But it's an honest one. I trap, I hunt, I trade furs in town a few times a year. It's enough. Do you have family? People who worry about you? Something flickered across his face, there and gone so quick she almost missed it. Not anymore. Lost my parents before the war and my brother died at Shiloh. I'm the last of the Emersons, I reckon. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. He pushed his empty plate away. What about you? Your father ever mention any other family? She shook her head. It was just the two of us for as long as I can remember. My mother died when I was a baby. Father never remarried, never even talked about her much. I think it hurt too much. And now you're alone out here. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. I manage. I can see that. His eyes traveled around the cabin, taking in the neatly swept floors, the orderly shelves, the mended curtains on the windows. But managing and thriving are two different things. Winter's hard up here even when you're prepared. Alone, it's harder still. She bristled slightly at that. I'm stronger than I look. Never said you weren't. He stood, his head nearly brushing the ceiling beams. But strength only gets you so far when the snow's piled to the roof and the temperature drops so low the sap freezes in the trees. You need supplies, fuel, and a plan. And you're going to provide all that out of the goodness of your heart. The wood, yes. The rest you'll need to sort yourself, but I can point you in the right direction. He headed for the door. There's still plenty of daylight left. I'd like to get that whole tree processed before dark. True to his word, he worked until the sun was touching the western peaks, splitting and stacking until the entire massive pine had been reduced to neatly cut pieces, filling the lean-to. Violet helped until her arms felt like they might fall off, then kept helping anyway. By the time he finally set down the axe, she was exhausted but satisfied. The lean-to was perhaps a quarter full, more wood than she'd had in months. I'll be back in a few days with another load, he said, pulling on his fur jacket as the evening chill set in. Maybe sooner if the weather holds. Vincent. She used his name for the first time and he paused. Thank you, really. I don't know what I would have done without this. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the fading light. Your father was a good man. He deserved better than dying young and leaving his daughter alone in these mountains. Least I can do is make sure you survive the winter. Then he was gone, disappearing into the twilight as silently as he'd come. Violet stood in the doorway until she couldn't see him anymore, then went inside and collapsed into her father's chair by the fire. Her whole body ached, but it was the good kind of ache that came from honest work. She looked at the stack of fresh wood beside the fireplace and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Over the next 2 weeks, Vincent returned 4 more times, each time dragging down another massive tree trunk and spending hours reducing it to usable firewood. The lean-to filled steadily, and Violet began to believe she might actually make it through the winter. She fell into a routine of helping him when he came, working alongside him in comfortable silence that gradually gave way to conversation. She learned that he'd grown up on a farm in Ohio, that he'd learned to hunt and trap from his grandfather, and that he'd seen things during the war that still haunted his dreams. He never went into detail about the war, but sometimes she'd catch a look in his eyes that spoke of old pain and memories he'd rather forget. In turn, she told him about growing up in the cabin, about her father teaching her to read using an old Bible and a worn copy of Shakespeare's plays, about the loneliness of living so far from town and other people. She told him about the fear that had gripped her when her father died, leaving her alone with winter coming and no idea how to manage on her own. "You're managing better than you think," he said one afternoon, as they took a break from splitting wood. They were sitting on the cabin's small porch, drinking water from a shared canteen. Most people would have panicked and run for town by now. "I thought about it," she admitted, "but this cabin is all I have. If I leave, I'll lose it. Someone else will claim the land and I'll have nothing." "You thought about staying in town for the winter. Come back in spring." She had thought about it, spent long nights weighing the options. "I don't have money for lodging and I don't have skills that would earn me much. I can read and write, but there's not much call for that in Taylorsville. I'd end up working in one of the saloons or taking in laundry, barely scraping by. At least here I have a roof over my head that's mine." He nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. "It's a hard choice. Everything's a hard choice out here." "True enough." He stood, stretching his back. She tried not to stare at the way his shirt pulled tight across his chest and shoulders with the movement. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd become increasingly aware of him in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude for his help. The way he moved, all controlled power and masculine grace. The sound of his voice, deep and rough like distant thunder. The rare moments when he smiled, transforming his weathered face into something almost boyish. She'd been alone too long, she told herself. That was all this was. Her mind playing tricks on her, latching onto the first man who'd shown her kindness in months. It didn't mean anything, but when he left each evening, the cabin felt emptier than it had before he'd started coming around. She found herself listening for the sound of his axe in the morning, watching the tree line for his familiar figure. She took more care with her appearance on the days she thought he might come, pinning her hair more carefully and wearing her better dress instead of the patched work clothes she usually favored. It was foolish, she knew. Vincent Emerson was a mountain man, someone who'd chosen solitude over society. He was helping her out of obligation to her father, nothing more. Once the wood was done and winter closed in, she probably wouldn't see him again until spring, if then. The lean-to was nearly 3/4 full when he arrived one morning looking troubled. Violet knew immediately something was different by the set of his shoulders and the grim line of his mouth. "What's wrong?" she asked, meeting him in the clearing. "Ran into some men yesterday, up near my camp. Drifters by the look of them, 3 of them, all carrying more weapons than any honest man needs." He set down his axe, his hand resting on the hunting knife at his belt. "They were asking questions about who lives up in these hills, whether there are any easy pickings." Fear clutched at her chest. "You think they'll come here?" "I think they might, which is why I'm telling you. You need to be careful, Violet. Keep your door barred at night, and if you see anyone you don't recognize, you hide. Don't try to talk to them or reason with them. I have my father's rifle. You know how to use it," she nodded. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was 14, insisting she needed to know how to defend herself and hunt for food. She wasn't a great shot, but she could hit what she aimed at if it wasn't too far away. "Good. Keep it loaded and close." He looked toward the tree line, his jaw tight. "I don't like this. Might be they're just passing through, but might be they're looking for isolated places to rob. Woman alone in a cabin would be a tempting target." The way he said it made her stomach turn. She knew what men like that could do to a woman. Everyone knew, even if they didn't talk about it directly. "What should I do?" He was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with something. Finally, he said, "I could stay here, sleep in the lean-to or out by the fire pit, just until we know those men have moved on." "You do that?" "Rather do that than leave you here alone, wondering if tonight's the night they show up." The relief that flooded through her was so intense it made her knees weak. "I'd be grateful, truly." They spent that day finishing the wood supply, filling the lean-to to the brim and starting a second stack under the porch overhang. As the sun set, Vincent built up the fire in the fireplace and then made himself a bedroll on the floor near the door. Violet protested, saying she could give him the bed, but he refused. "I'm used to sleeping rough," he said, "and I'll hear better down here if anyone approaches in the night." She lay in her bed, acutely aware of him just a few feet away, listening to his steady breathing in the darkness. The cabin felt different with him in it, safer but also charged with something she couldn't quite name. She'd been alone for so long that having another person this close, especially a man, felt almost overwhelming, but it also felt right in a way she didn't want to examine too closely. The next morning she woke to find him already up and moving quietly around the cabin, adding wood to the fire. "Didn't mean to wake you," he said when he saw her watching. "You didn't. I usually wake with the sun." She climbed out of bed, suddenly self-conscious about her nightgown and loose hair. "I'll make breakfast." They fell into an easy domesticity that morning, moving around each other in the small space as if they'd been doing it for years rather than days. He brought in fresh water from the stream while she prepared cornmeal mush and the last of her dried apples. They ate together as the morning light strengthened, and then he announced he was going to scout the area, make sure those drifters weren't nearby. "I'll be back before dark," he promised. "Keep the door barred while I'm gone." She did as he asked, spending the day inside doing mending and trying not to jump at every sound. The hours crawled by, and when the sun started to sink toward the horizon without any sign of Vincent, she began to worry. What if he'd run into those men? What if there had been trouble? But just as full darkness fell, she heard his familiar footstep on the porch. She unbarred the door and let him in, unable to hide her relief. "Find anything?" "Tracks, heading east toward the main trail. Looks like they moved on, probably toward Taylorsville." He shrugged off his jacket. "I'll stay tonight to be sure, but I think the danger's past." That night followed the same pattern as the one before, but Violet found herself less able to sleep. She lay in the darkness, listening to the fire crackle and Vincent's steady breathing, and felt an ache in her chest that had nothing to do with fear or loneliness. Or maybe it had everything to do with loneliness, just a different kind than she'd felt before. She'd gotten used to him being here. More than used to it, she'd come to need it in a way that terrified her. In just a few weeks, Vincent Emerson had become essential to her life, and she had no idea what that meant or what to do about it. The next morning, he packed up his bedroll after breakfast and announced that he needed to get back to his own camp, check his trap lines. "But I'll come back in a few days," he added. "Make sure everything's still quiet." "You don't have to. I know." He stood in the doorway, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "But I will anyway." After he left, the cabin felt cavernous and empty. Violet threw herself into work, cleaning things that were already clean, organizing shelves that were already organized, anything to keep her mind occupied. But as evening fell and she sat alone by the fire, she couldn't deny the truth any longer. She was falling in love with Vincent Emerson. It was foolish and impractical and probably hopeless, but it was true nonetheless. Somewhere between that first day when he'd appeared out of the storm and now, he'd worked his way into her heart. Not just because he'd helped her, though that was part of it, but because of who he was, strong and capable and kind in a quiet, unassuming way. Because he kept his word and asked for nothing in return. Because when he looked at her, she felt seen in a way she never had before. But what did he feel? He was kind to her, protective even, but that might just be his nature. He'd said himself that he preferred solitude, that he'd chosen this isolated life deliberately. A man like that probably wasn't looking for romantic entanglement, especially not with a woman who lived 2 miles from his camp. She told herself to be practical, to protect her heart. But 3 days later, when she heard his axe bite into wood and went to the window to see him dragging another dead tree into the clearing, her heart soared anyway. He came inside for coffee when she offered it, his hair damp with sweat despite the cold. They sat at her small table, the comfortable silence of the past weeks settling over them. But something felt different today, a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Everything been quiet. He asked. Yes, no sign of anyone. Good. He drained his coffee and set down the cup but didn't get up. Instead, he sat there, turning the empty cup in his large hands, clearly working up to saying something. Vincent, is something wrong? No, maybe, I don't know. He looked up at her, and the intensity in his pale eyes made her breath catch. I've been thinking. About winter, about you here alone, about a lot of things. What kind of things? The kind a man probably shouldn't think about a woman he barely knows. He said it bluntly, watching her face for a reaction. The kind that keep him awake at night in his camp, wondering if she's safe, if she's warm enough, if she's thinking about him too. Violet's heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. I think about you, she admitted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. All the time, too much, probably. Something in his expression softened, the hard edges gentling. That's so. I told myself it was just gratitude or loneliness or anything other than what it actually is. But I'm tired of lying to myself. And what is it actually? She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I think I'm falling in love with you. I know that's probably not what you want to hear, and I know you chose this life because you prefer being alone, but I can't help how I feel. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving her face. Then, slowly, he reached across the table and took her hand in his. His palm was rough and calloused, his fingers easily engulfing hers, and the touch sent warmth racing up her arm. What I want, he said quietly, is to stay. Not just for a night or until the danger passes. I want to stay through the winter, wake up to you every morning, make sure you're safe and warm and cared for. I want all of that so badly it scares me, because I never thought I'd want those things again. Then why don't you? Because wanting something and being good for someone are two different things. His thumb traced slow circles on the back of her hand. I'm not an easy man, Violet. I've been alone too long, got too used to my own ways. I'm rough around the edges, got demons from the war that wake me up sometimes. You deserve better than what I am. Shouldn't I be the one to decide what I deserve? He let out a short laugh. Suppose you should at that. I'm not looking for perfection, Vincent. I'm looking for someone real, someone honest, someone who sees me as more than just a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed. She squeezed his hand. That's what you've been to me. From that first day, you've treated me like I matter, like my survival and my well-being are important. Do you have any idea what that means to someone who's been invisible for most of her life? You could never be invisible. He said it with such conviction that she felt tears prick at her eyes. You're the brightest thing in these mountains. She stood, still holding his hand, and came around the table to stand in front of him. He looked up at her, something vulnerable and uncertain in his expression that she'd never seen before. This strong, capable man who faced down storms and wild animals without flinching was scared of this of them. Stay, she said simply. Not just for winter. Stay. He rose to his feet, towering over her but somehow making her feel protected rather than threatened. His free hand came up to cup her face, his touch surprisingly gentle for someone so strong. If I stay, I'm going to want everything. Not just to share your cabin, but to share your life. I need you to understand that. I do understand. Do you? Because I'm talking about marriage, Violet. About standing up in front of the preacher in Taylorsville and making it legal and proper. I won't live with you any other way. I won't risk your reputation or give people cause to talk." Her breath caught. "You want to marry me, more than I've wanted anything in a very long time." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, tracing the curve of her face like he was memorizing it. "But only if it's what you want to, only if you're sure." "I'm sure." She'd never been more sure of anything in her life. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." The smile that broke across his face transformed him completely, making him look younger and lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He bent his head and kissed her, his lips warm and firm against hers, and Violet felt like she was flying. She wound her arms around his neck, pressing close, and his arms came around her waist, holding her tight against his solid bulk. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "We should go to town tomorrow. Get married before I lose my nerve or you come to your senses." She laughed, giddy with happiness. "I'm not going to come to my senses. Give it time," he said, but he was smiling. "Now I need to get back to work on that tree. But tonight, I'm sleeping on this floor again, proper-like, until we've said our vows. I'll do this right by you, Violet. I know you will." The next morning dawned clear and cold, perfect weather for the ride into Taylorsville. Vincent had returned to his camp the night before to collect his things and his horse, a massive black gelding that matched his owner in size and temperament. He showed up at first light with the horse saddled and ready, along with a pack horse carrying his possessions. "This is everything you own?" Violet asked, looking at the surprisingly modest load. "Never needed much. Traps, tools, spare clothes, some supplies. That's about it." He helped her onto his horse, then swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to hold the reins. The intimacy of the position, pressed back against his broad chest, made her blush. The ride into Taylorsville took most of the morning. The town sat in a valley where several trails converged, a rough collection of wooden buildings that had grown up around a trading post and now served as the main supply center for the scattered homesteads and mining camps in the area. Violet hadn't been to town since her father's death, and she felt nervous as they rode down the main street. Vincent seemed to sense her tension. "It'll be fine," he murmured near her ear. "Anyone gives you trouble, they'll answer to me." The preacher was a kindly older man named Reverend Thompson, who ran the small church at the end of town. He seemed unsurprised when Vincent explained what they needed. "Been wondering when you'd finally decide to settle down, Vincent," the Reverend said with a smile. "And Miss Brennan, I was sorry to hear about your father. He was a good man." "Thank you," Violet said quietly. "Now, you're both of age and of sound mind, I take it. No one's forcing this union." "No, sir," they said together. "And you understand that marriage is a sacred commitment, not to be entered into lightly." Vincent's hand found Violet's, his fingers lacing through hers. "We understand, Reverend." The ceremony was simple and quick. Just the necessary words spoken in the empty church, with the Reverend's wife pulled in as a witness. But when Vincent slipped a gold ring onto Violet's finger and spoke his vows in that deep, steady voice, promising to love and protect her for the rest of their lives, it felt more real and meaningful than the grandest celebration could have been. When the Reverend pronounced them married and told Vincent he could kiss his bride, he did so with a tenderness that brought tears to Violet's eyes. This was real. This rough, strong man was her husband now, and she was his wife, and whatever challenges lay ahead, they'd face them together. They spent the rest of the day in town, buying supplies they'd need to get through the winter. Vincent seemed to have more money than Violet had expected, coins and bills tucked away in his saddlebags from years of trading furs. He insisted on buying her a new dress, warm wool stockings, and a heavy winter coat that would keep her warm when the truly cold weather arrived. "I can't let you spend all your money on me," she protested, as he added more items to their growing pile. "It's our money now," he corrected gently. "And I've been living like a hermit for 8 years, barely spending anything. Let me do this, Violet. Let me take care of you." She stopped arguing and let him buy what he thought they needed. It felt strange and wonderful to have someone looking out for her welfare this way, considering her needs and comfort. Her father had loved her, but he'd been a practical man who didn't think much about things like new dresses or extra blankets. Vincent seemed determined to make sure she had everything she could possibly want. As the sun started to sink toward the horizon, they loaded up their purchases and headed back toward the cabin. Violet rode in front of Vincent again, pleasantly tired from the long day and lulled by the steady rhythm of the horse's gait. His arms were warm around her, his chest solid at her back, and she felt safer than she had in months. "Happy?" he asked as they climbed into the hills. "Very." She leaned back against him. "Are you?" "More than I thought I could be." His lips brushed her hair. "Thought I was done with all this, you know. Thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone in these mountains and that would be enough. Then I found you in that storm and everything changed." "Do you think it's crazy, getting married so fast?" "Maybe. But I've learned that when you find something good in this life, you don't let it slip away. You hold on tight and you don't look back." They reached the cabin as darkness fell. Vincent tended to the horses while Violet started a fire and put coffee on to boil. When he came inside, stamping snow from his boots, the domesticity of it struck her all over again. This was her husband, coming home to her cabin that was now their cabin, and they had a whole life ahead of them. That night, after they'd eaten and the fire had burned down to coals, he laid out his bedroll on the floor again. Violet stared at him in confusion. "What are you doing?" "Giving you time to get used to things. This is all happening fast, and I don't want you to feel pressured." "Vincent Emerson, we're married. Get into this bed with me." He looked at her, something hot and intense flaring in his eyes. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." He didn't need to be told twice. He crossed the small cabin in 3 strides and gathered her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that made her head spin. She kissed him back just as fiercely, pouring all her love and desire and certainty into it. Whatever nervousness she'd felt evaporated under the warmth of his touch, the gentle strength in his hands as he held her. That night, Vincent proved to be as gentle and considerate a lover as he was in everything else. He took his time, making sure she was comfortable and cared for, and when they finally came together as husband and wife, Violet felt something click into place in her soul. This was right. This was where she was meant to be. Afterwards, she lay tucked against his side, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow. His arm was around her shoulders, holding her close, and she felt utterly content. "I love you," she said quietly. "I should have said it before, during the ceremony, but I was nervous and it didn't come out right. But I love you, Vincent, completely." His arm tightened around her. "I love you too. Didn't think I'd ever say those words again, but here we are." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever, Violet. Hope. A reason to look forward instead of back." She snuggled closer, warm and happy and home in a way that had nothing to do with the cabin's 4 walls and everything to do with the man holding her. The first real snow came a week later, fat flakes falling steadily from a gray sky and blanketing the world in white. Violet stood on the porch, wrapped in her new coat, watching it fall while Vincent finished securing the lean-to and checking that everything was battened down for winter. The past week had been a revelation. Living with Vincent, being married to him, was nothing like she'd imagined and somehow better than any fantasy. He was patient and kind, quick to laugh when she made mistakes in the kitchen, and never critical when things didn't go perfectly. He'd taken over the heavier chores without being asked, chopping wood and hauling water and checking the roof for leaks. But more than that, he was present in a way she'd never experienced before. He listened when she talked, really listened, and remembered the small things she mentioned. He asked her opinion on decisions and actually considered her answers. He treated her like an equal partner in their life together, not a subordinate or a burden. And at night, wrapped in his arms in the bed they now shared, she felt cherished in a way that still made her breath catch. "That's everything secured," Vincent said, climbing the porch steps and shaking snow from his hair. "We're ready for whatever winter throws at us. Thanks to you. Thanks to us." He pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, loving the way he made her feel small and protected. "You worked just as hard as I did getting ready." She had helped, it was true. Together they'd salted meat, dried vegetables, checked and rechecked their supplies. The cabin was warm and well-stocked, the lean-to full of wood, the roof sound and the walls chinked tight against the cold. They were as ready as they could be. The snow fell steadily for 3 days, piling up past the porch and blocking the trails. They were effectively cut off from the outside world, but Violet found she didn't mind. The cabin felt cozy rather than confining, especially with Vincent there to share it. They spent the long hours talking, playing cards, reading aloud from her father's books. Vincent had a fine reading voice when he could be convinced to use it, and hearing him read Shakespeare's words in that deep rumble was a pleasure she'd never expected. "You're better educated than you let on," she said one evening as he finished a particularly moving passage from Romeo and Juliet. "My mother was a school teacher before she married. She made sure both her sons could read and write properly, do sums, know our history." He closed the book carefully. "Most of that education didn't seem too useful during the war or after, but I'm glad I have it now." "Why?" "Because I can read to my wife on winter evenings." He smiled at her. "And because any children we might have will need teaching. Can't rely on there being a school up here in the mountains." Children. They hadn't talked about that possibility directly, though of course it was always there, implicit in their marriage. Violet felt her cheeks warm. "You want children, if we're blessed with them, yes." He set the book aside and pulled her close. "Do you?" "I think so." "It's scary to think about, raising children in such an isolated place. But yes, I'd like that. Then we'll hope for it and see what God provides." The snow finally stopped on the 4th day, leaving the world transformed into something pristine and beautiful. Vincent bundled up and went to check his trap lines, returning several hours later with 2 rabbits and a report that the trails were passable if difficult. "Might need to make a trip to my old camp," he said that evening as they ate rabbit stew. "I left some things there when I moved in here and I'd like to retrieve them before the next storm." "What kind of things?" "Tools mostly. Some furs I'd already processed, my grandfather's rifle," he hesitated, "and a few personal items, things from before. Before the war, he meant. Before he'd lost everyone and everything and fled to these mountains to escape his grief." Violet reached across the table and took his hand. "I'd like to see where you lived if you want to show me. It's rough. Just a lean-to and a fire pit, nothing like this cabin. Still, it was your home for 8 years. I want to know all parts of you, Vincent, not just the parts you think I want to see." He squeezed her hand gently. "We'll go tomorrow then if the weather holds." The next morning dawned clear and bright, the sun turning the snow to diamonds. They bundled up in their warmest clothes and set out on Vincent's horse, following trails that were barely visible under the snow. Violet sat in front of him as always, trusting him to navigate the treacherous terrain. His camp was about 2 miles north, tucked into a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. He'd been accurate in his description. It was rough, Just a simple lean-to made of logs and bark, a stone-ringed fire pit, and some basic supplies stored in a wooden box suspended from a tree to keep bears out. But there was something almost peaceful about the place, isolated and quiet, the kind of refuge a wounded soul might seek. "I can see why you stayed here," Violet said as Vincent helped her down from the horse. "It's beautiful in its own way. It served its purpose." He moved around the camp, gathering the items he wanted. His movements were efficient but tinged with something that might have been nostalgia or sadness. "I was angry when I first came up here, angry at the war and at God and at myself for surviving when so many didn't. This place let me work through that anger, gave me space to heal. And now," he looked at her, his pale eyes soft, "now I've got something better to go home to." They packed up his belongings quickly, loading them onto the pack horse he'd brought. As they were finishing, Vincent paused and pulled something from the wooden box. It was a small leather-bound book, worn and water-stained. "This was my brother's," he said quietly. "He kept a journal during the war. I've never been able to bring myself to read it, but I couldn't leave it behind either." Violet took the journal carefully, feeling the weight of grief and memory it represented. "Maybe someday you'll be ready. Maybe." He tucked it into his coat. "Or maybe you could read it, tell me what he wrote. Might be easier hearing it from you. If you want that, I will." They rode back to the cabin as the short winter day began to fade. That evening, after they'd eaten and were settled by the fire, Violet opened her brother-in-law's journal and began to read. The entries were sporadic and brief, written by a young man trying to make sense of the madness of war. But through the accounts of battles and marches, a picture emerged of someone thoughtful and kind, someone who'd cared deeply about his older brother and worried about what the war was doing to him. Vincent sat silent through it all, his face unreadable in the firelight. When Violet reached the final entry, written just days before the battle that had claimed his brother's life, her voice wavered. The young man had written about hope for the future, about plans to return to Ohio and help Vincent run the farm, about a girl back home he hoped to marry. All those dreams cut short by a Confederate bullet. She closed the journal gently and looked at Vincent. His eyes were wet, tears tracking slowly down his weathered cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have read, no." He cut her off, his voice rough with emotion. "I needed to hear it. Needed to remember he was more than just another casualty, another name on a list. He was my little brother, and he had dreams and plans, and I've been so caught up in my own grief that I'd almost forgotten that." Violet set the journal aside and went to him, climbing into his lap and wrapping her arms around his neck. He held her tight, his face buried in her shoulder, and she felt the shudders run through his large frame as he finally, truly mourned the brother he'd lost. They sat like that for a long time, the fire crackling and the wind howling outside, and Violet felt the last walls around Vincent's heart finally crumble. He'd let her in completely now, shown her his deepest pain, and she loved him all the more for trusting her with it. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice muffled against her shoulder, "for rating that, for being here, for giving me a reason to live again instead of just surviving." "You've given me the same thing," she said, running her fingers through his long hair. "We saved each other, I think." Winter settled in with a vengeance after that, storm after storm piling snow higher and higher until the cabin was almost buried. But inside, warm and well-supplied, Violet and Vincent built their life together. They talked for hours, sharing stories from their pasts, learning each other's habits and quirks. They worked side by side on small projects, Vincent carving wooden spoons and bowls while Violet sewed and mended. They played cards and read books and made love with a passion that never seemed to diminish. One night in January, during a particularly fierce blizzard, Violet woke to find Vincent thrashing in his sleep, caught in a nightmare. She shook him awake gently, and he came up gasping, his eyes wild. "It's all right," she soothed, holding his face between her hands. "You're safe. You're here with me." He focused on her gradually, the terror fading from his eyes. "Sorry, I was back there in the war. Sometimes it feels so real I can smell the gunpowder and blood." "I know." She'd learned over the months that the nightmares came sometimes, usually when the weather was bad or he was overtired. "But you're here now. The war's over. You survived." "Because I hid," he said bitterly. "Because I ran away to these mountains instead of going home and facing what I'd become." "You didn't run away. You retreated to heal, and there's no shame in that." She kissed his forehead. "And you didn't hide forever. You came back, helped people, made a life. You helped me when I needed it most, and I'll always be grateful for that." He pulled her close, holding her like she was the only solid thing in a shifting world. "What did I do to deserve you? You showed up when I needed you. Everything else just followed." The nightmares became less frequent as winter wore on, and Violet liked to think her presence helped. Vincent seemed calmer, more settled, the old wounds gradually healing. He laughed more easily now, and sometimes she'd catch him watching her with such open affection it made her blush. February brought a brief thaw, and they ventured out to check the countryside. The snow was still deep, but the trails were passable, and Vincent suggested they ride to the ridge overlooking the valley. "I want to show you something," he said mysteriously. They rode together through the sparkling white landscape, the horse's breath steaming in the cold air. At the ridge, Vincent helped her down and led her to a spot where the trees opened up to reveal a breathtaking view. The entire valley spread below them, the mountains rising on all sides, pristine and beautiful in their winter coat. "I used to come here sometimes," he said, standing behind her with his arms around her waist. "When I needed to remember there was still beauty in the world, even after everything ugly I'd seen. It's incredible. I'm glad you're seeing it with me." He turned her to face him, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about the future, Violet, about what happens when spring comes." "What do you mean?" "I mean that cabin is small for one person, let alone two, and if God blesses us with children, it'll be even more cramped." He cupped her face gently. "I want to build us a proper house, something bigger and sturdier, maybe down in the valley where the land's more level. I've got money saved from fur trading and I'm good with my hands. We could have something real, something lasting." Hope bloomed in her chest. "You do that, build a house." "For you, I'd build a castle if I could," he smiled. "But I'll settle for a solid house with room for a family. What do you think?" "I think it sounds wonderful." She went up on her toes to kiss him. "I think you're wonderful." He kissed her back, deep and long, and then swung her up in his arms, making her laugh. "We should get back before it gets dark, but I wanted you to see this place, to know what we have to look forward to when winter ends." They rode back to the cabin as the sun set, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. That night, Violet lay awake for a while after Vincent fell asleep, thinking about the future he described. A house of their own, built with his hands and their combined dreams. Children running through rooms filled with light and laughter. A life, real and solid and good. She'd thought she was alone and lost when that storm had caught her gathering wood all those months ago. She'd thought she had nothing to look forward to but struggle and loneliness. But Vincent had changed everything, given her not just wood for the winter but hope for a lifetime. In March, as the snow began to melt and the first hints of spring appeared, Violet realized she'd missed her monthly courses. She waited another week to be sure, then told Vincent over breakfast one morning. "I think I'm carrying," she said simply, watching his face for his reaction. He went very still, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. Then slowly, carefully, he set it down. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor. But yes, I think so." The smile that broke across his face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "A baby. We're having a baby. Are you happy?" "Happy?" He came around the table and pulled her into his arms, lifting her clean off her feet. "I'm beyond happy. I'm terrified and thrilled and more grateful than I can say." She laughed, holding tight to his shoulders. "Put me down, you crazy man. You'll hurt yourself." "Not likely." But he set her down gently, his hands going to her still flat stomach with a sense of wonder. "There's a baby in there. Our baby." "Our baby," she agreed, covering his hands with hers. The rest of the month passed in a blur of planning and preparation. Vincent became even more protective, if that was possible, insisting she rest more and not lift heavy things. He started drawing plans for the house he wanted to build, showing her sketches and asking her opinion on everything from window placement to the size of the kitchen. "I want it finished before the baby comes," he said one evening as they pored over his latest drawing. "I want you safe and comfortable when your time comes. That gives you about 6 months. Then I'll work fast." As soon as the trails were fully clear in April, they made a trip to Taylorsville to share the news with Reverend Thompson and to buy supplies for the coming months. The Reverend was delighted, pronouncing them blessed and promising to visit once the house was built to bless their new home. They also stopped at the general store, where Vincent commissioned lumber and other building materials to be delivered. The storekeeper, a shrewd-eyed man named Parker, looked impressed by the scale of what Vincent was planning. "That's a big project for one man," he said. "I'll manage." Vincent's tone didn't invite argument. "I'm sure you will. When do you want delivery?" "As soon as the roads are good enough for your wagons." They rode back to the cabin loaded down with supplies and full of plans. Vincent had chosen a site for the house down in the valley, near a creek that would provide fresh water year-round. It was about a mile from the old cabin, close enough to be convenient but far enough to feel like a fresh start. The lumber arrived in early May, hauled up by wagon teams that struggled with the rough roads but eventually deposited everything at the building site. Vincent started work immediately, rising before dawn and working until dark, determined to make good on his promise to have the house ready before winter. Violet helped where she could, but as her pregnancy progressed, Vincent became increasingly insistent that she take it easy. She compromised by bringing him meals at the worksite and helping with smaller tasks like sorting nails or organizing supplies. It was remarkable to watch the house take shape under his hands. He worked with a skill and precision that spoke of deep experience, each board placed exactly right, each joint tight and true. The frame went up first, tall and strong, then the walls and roof. By July, it was weathertight and he'd started on the interior work. "It's beautiful," Violet said one evening as they stood looking at their nearly finished home. Her belly was round now, the baby active and strong inside her. "It's almost ready." He wrapped an arm around her carefully, mindful of her swollen middle. "Another few weeks and we can move in." They moved into the new house in August, just as the first hints of autumn began to color the leaves. It was everything Vincent had promised and more. Spacious and sturdy, with large windows that let in plenty of light, a proper kitchen, and 2 bedrooms, one for them and one for the baby who would arrive soon. Vincent had built furniture too, a large bed frame, a table and chairs, shelves and cabinets. Every piece showed his care and skill, and Violet loved running her hands over the smooth wood, thinking about how he'd made all this for her and their child. The baby came in October, on a crisp morning when the mountains were dressed in gold and crimson. Violet's labor started just after dawn, and Vincent rode like fury to Taylorsville to fetch the midwife, an experienced woman named Mrs. Chen who delivered half the babies in the territory. The labor was long and hard, but Mrs. Chen was patient and skilled, guiding Violet through it while Vincent paced outside, too nervous to sit still. Finally, as the sun was setting, a baby's cry split the air. Vincent burst through the door, his eyes wild. "Violet, come meet your son, Mrs. Chen said with a smile, handing him a bundle wrapped in soft blankets. A son. Vincent took the baby carefully, his large hands cradling the tiny body with infinite gentleness. "Hello, little one," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm your papa." Violet, exhausted but happy, watched from the bed as her husband bonded with their newborn son. The baby had a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably be blue like his father's. He was perfect, absolutely perfect. "What should we name him?" Vincent asked, sitting on the edge of the bed so Violet could see too. They discussed names but never settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Violet knew. "James, after your brother." Vincent's eyes filled with tears. "You do that, I think it's right. Your brother should be remembered, and this way he will be in the best possible way." "James Emerson," Vincent said, trying out the name. The baby yawned, tiny and pink, completely unaware of the legacy he carried. "Thank you, Violet. Thank you for everything." Mrs. Chen stayed for a week, making sure both Violet and the baby were healthy and teaching them the basics of newborn care. Vincent proved to be a natural father, patient and gentle with his son, willing to walk the floor at all hours when the baby was fussy. When Mrs. Chen finally left, assuring them they were doing fine, they settled into their new routine. Vincent took over most of the household chores, insisting Violet focus on recovering and caring for the baby. He cooked, cleaned, chopped wood, and still found time to sit with his wife and son each evening, reading aloud or just talking quietly while the baby nursed. "I never imagined this," he said one night as they sat by the fire, little James sleeping between them. "A year ago I was alone in these mountains, thinking I'd die alone. Now I have a wife I love more than life itself and a son who's going to grow up knowing peace instead of war. It's more than I deserve." "You deserve every happiness," Violet said firmly. "You're a good man, Vincent Emerson, and a wonderful husband and father." He reached over the sleeping baby to take her hand. "I found you in a storm, gathering firewood you couldn't carry, and I thought I was just helping someone in need. I didn't know I was finding my future, my whole heart." "But I was. We found each other," she corrected gently, "and built something beautiful together." Winter came again, but this time they were more than ready. The house was warm and solid, the shelters stocked with enough wood to last 2 winters, the pantry full of preserved food. And most importantly, they had each other and their son, a family bound by love and forged in the challenging beauty of the Montana mountains. Spring arrived with the usual drama of melting snow and rushing streams. James was 6 months old now, a happy baby who smiled at everything and was just starting to try to sit up on his own. Vincent had gone back to trapping, but on a limited basis, staying close to home and always making sure he was back by evening. One afternoon in May, Violet was in the garden she'd started beside the house, planting vegetables with James watching from a blanket nearby, when she heard horses approaching. She stood, shading her eyes, and recognized Reverend Thompson and his wife riding up the trail. "Reverend, Mrs. Thompson." What a lovely surprise. They dismounted and came over, the Reverend beaming. "We promised we'd visit, and the weather's finally good enough for travel. We wanted to see how you were settling in and meet this little one we've heard so much about." Violet invited them in, serving coffee and the bread she'd baked that morning. Vincent came in from checking his trap lines and greeted their guests warmly. They spent the afternoon talking and catching up on news from town. The Reverend blessed their home as promised, walking through each room and saying prayers for health and happiness. Before they left, the Reverend pulled Vincent aside. "You've done well for yourself, son. This house, your family, it's good to see." "Thank you, Reverend. I wouldn't have any of it without Violet. Marriage is like that. We bring out the best in each other if we're lucky." The Reverend clapped him on the shoulder. "You take care of that family of yours." "With my life," Vincent promised. As summer bloomed, they fell into a comfortable rhythm. Vincent worked on improving their property, building a proper barn and expanding the garden. Violet cared for James and the house, and started teaching herself to preserve more kinds of food, wanting to be even better prepared for the next winter. James grew quickly, reaching all his milestones on time or early. He started crawling in July, pulling himself up on furniture in August, and taking his first wobbling steps in September, just before his first birthday. Vincent was endlessly patient with him, never too busy to play or read stories or just sit with his son exploring the world around them. "He's going to be tall like you," Violet observed one evening as they watched James toddle around the main room, clutching furniture for support. "Poor kid." But Vincent was grinning. "At least he'll have your brains to make up for my rough edges. He'll have the best of both of us." That winter was easier than the first, partly because they were better prepared but mostly because they were an established family now, comfortable with each other and their routines. James kept them busy and laughing, his personality emerging more each day. He was curious and fearless, always trying to explore new things, and both his parents had to watch him constantly to keep him safe. In the spring, Violet realized she was pregnant again. She told Vincent on a warm May evening as they sat on the porch watching James play in the dirt. "Another one." Vincent looked delighted. "When?" "November, I think." He pulled her close, kissing her temple. "Our family's growing. Are you happy about that? Are you joking?" "I'm thrilled. I always wanted a big family, just never thought I'd have the chance." He paused. "How do you feel about it?" "A little overwhelmed," she admitted. "James is barely a year old and soon we'll have two, but mostly happy. I love being a mother and I love seeing you as a father." Their second child, a daughter they named Lily, arrived right on schedule in November. The birth was faster and easier than James's had been, and Mrs. Chen pronounced both mother and baby healthy and strong. Lily had her mother's honey-colored hair and a sunny disposition that charmed everyone who met her. James was initially uncertain about the new arrival, but Vincent was patient in helping him adjust, making sure the toddler knew he was still loved and important. Within weeks, James was proudly showing his baby sister to anyone who visited, though he wasn't allowed to hold her without supervision. The years flowed past like water in the creek, each one bringing new joys and challenges. James grew into a sturdy, serious boy who loved helping his father with outdoor work. Lily was sunshine and laughter, always singing and dancing around the house. In 1881, they had another son, Peter, who proved to be the quietest of the three children, content to sit and observe the world around him. Vincent proved to be everything Violet had hoped for and more as a husband and father. He was patient and kind, firm when necessary, but never harsh. He taught the children to read and write, to hunt and fish, to respect the land and the creatures that shared it with them. He expanded their house as the family grew, adding rooms and improving things constantly. Violet thrived in her role as wife and mother. She taught the children alongside Vincent, focusing on literature and music and art when he taught practical skills. She kept a warm, welcoming home, and her garden grew more productive each year. She wrote letters to Mrs. Chen and a few other friends they'd made in town, maintaining connections to the wider world even in their isolated valley. In 1883, when James was 8, Lily 6, and Peter 2, they made a trip to Taylorsville for supplies. The town had grown considerably since Violet had first come there to marry Vincent, with new buildings and more families. They ran into Reverend Thompson, who was delighted to see how the family had grown. "You've been blessed," he told them, watching the children explore the general store with wide eyes. "More than we ever imagined," Vincent agreed, his arm around Violet's waist. That night, back at their home after the children were asleep, Vincent and Violet sat on the porch looking at the stars. It was something they'd done countless times over the years, these quiet moments together after the busy day was done. "You ever regret it?" Vincent asked. "Marrying me, living up here so far from everything." Violet didn't even have to think about it. "Never, not once. You gave me everything that matters, Vincent. Love, family, security, happiness. What more could I possibly want? I just want to make sure you're happy. I'm more than happy. I'm content in a way I never knew was possible." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "That day you found me in the storm, gathering firewood I couldn't carry. I thought I was at the end of my rope. I thought I'd lost everything and had nothing to look forward to but struggle and loneliness. And instead I found everything. You chopped wood enough to last me through the winter, but you gave me so much more than that. You gave me a life worth living, a future to look forward to, a family to love. You gave me yourself, and that was the greatest gift of all." He kissed her softly, his hand cupping her cheek. "I'm the one who got the gift. You brought me back to life, Violet, made me remember what it was to hope and dream and love. Everything good in my life started the day I found you in that storm." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. Inside, their children slept safely in their beds, and around them the mountains stood eternal and strong. It was a good life, hard sometimes but rich with love and meaning. As the years continued to pass, their family remained close. James grew into a young man much like his father, tall and strong and steady. He talked about staying in the mountains, maybe building his own cabin nearby someday. Lily became beautiful and bright, with a gift for music that delighted everyone who heard her sing. Peter developed a talent for woodworking, learning from Vincent and creating beautiful pieces that drew admiration. Vincent's hair turned gray at the temples, and lines deepened around his eyes, but he remained strong and capable, still able to outwork men half his age. Violet's beauty matured into something deeper and more lasting, her face showing the contentment of a woman who'd lived well and loved deeply. They had one more child in 1885, a surprise daughter they named Grace. She was their baby, spoiled by her older siblings and adored by her parents. By then, the house had been expanded twice more, and they had a thriving homestead with chickens, a milk cow, and a large garden that produced more than they could use. In the summer of 1890, when James was 15 and preparing to help his father build his own cabin, they received word that the territory was moving toward statehood. Montana would officially become a state soon, joining the Union and bringing more settlement and civilization to the mountains they called home. "Things are changing," Vincent said one evening as they discussed the news. "They always do," Violet replied, "but we'll adapt, like we always have. I worry sometimes about what all this development will mean for places like ours, for the wild spaces. Some will be lost, probably, but not all. These mountains are too big, too rough to ever be completely tamed. There will always be wild places here." He pulled her close, and she went into his arms as naturally as breathing, the way she had for 16 years now. I love you, Violet. Have I told you that today? Twice. But I never get tired of hearing it. I love you, he repeated, kissing her soundly. And I'll keep saying it every day for the rest of our lives. Good. She smiled up at him, this man who'd saved her life in more ways than one, who'd given her everything she'd never dared dream of. Because I love you too, Vincent Emerson. Today, tomorrow, and always. Montana became a state in November of 1889, but their lives didn't change much. They were too far from the centers of government and commerce for statehood to impact their daily existence. They continued as they always had, working hard, loving deeply, raising their children to be strong and kind and capable. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1898, Vincent surprised Violet with a gift. It was a small wooden box, beautifully carved with flowers and vines. Inside was a gold locket containing tiny photographs of their 5 children. I had it made in town, he explained as she examined it with tears in her eyes. I wanted you to have something special, something that showed what we've built together. It's beautiful. But Vincent, we agreed we wouldn't spend money on unnecessary things. This isn't unnecessary. This is important. He fastened the locket around her neck. You're important. Everything you've done, everything you've given me and our children, it deserves to be celebrated. She hugged him tight, breathing in the familiar scent of him, pine and wood smoke and safety. Thank you. For this, for everything, for 20 years of happiness. Here's to 20 more, he said, raising an imaginary glass. And 20 after that, if God's willing. God was willing, it seemed. The years continued to be kind to them. Their children grew and thrived. James built his cabin and married a young woman from town, giving them their first grandchild in 1900. Lily's beautiful voice attracted attention from as far away as Helena, and she was invited to sing at various events, though she always came home to the mountains she loved. Peter opened a woodworking shop in Taylorsville, creating furniture that was prized throughout the territory. Grace, their baby, showed signs of following in her mother's footsteps, already capable in the kitchen and garden at just 10 years old. Vincent and Violet grew old together gracefully, their love deepening with each passing year. They'd been through so much together, weathered storms both literal and figurative, and come through it all stronger. Their home was always full of life and laughter, with children and grandchildren coming and going, filling the rooms Vincent had built with his own hands decades before. On a warm summer evening in 1903, they sat on their porch as they had countless times before, watching the sun set behind the mountains. They were both in their 50s now, their children grown, their grandchildren starting families of their own. But they still had each other, still found comfort and joy in each other's presence. We did all right, didn't we? Vincent said, his hand finding hers as naturally as always. We did better than all right. We did wonderfully. That day I found you in the storm, I thought I was just helping someone in need. I never imagined that 25 years later I'd be sitting here with you, surrounded by the family we built, still as in love as I was then. More, even. More, Violet agreed. Because now I know you in ways I couldn't then. I know your heart and your soul, all your strengths and weaknesses, everything that makes you who you are. And I love all of it. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. You're my whole world, Violet. Always have been from that first moment. You always will be. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they sat together in perfect peace. Two souls who'd found each other in a storm and built a life that had weathered every challenge. The mountains stood eternal around them. The house Vincent had built was filled with the echoes of love and laughter, and their hearts were full. It had started with firewood in a storm, a simple act of kindness that had grown into something profound and lasting. Vincent had chopped enough wood to last her through that first winter, but what he'd really given her was hope enough to last a lifetime. And she'd given him the same, pulling him back from the darkness of his past, and showing him that love and family and joy were still possible, even after everything he'd lost. They'd saved each other, built a life together in the wild mountains of Montana, and created a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. Their children and grandchildren would remember the story of how they met, how a mountain man had found a woman gathering firewood in a storm and changed both their lives forever. It was a good story, a true story, a love story that had stood the test of time and would continue to inspire for generations to come. And as Vincent and Violet sat together under the Montana stars, their hands clasped and their hearts full, they knew they'd lived exactly the life they were meant to live together.